Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so this is the beginning of what I think is the most interesting part of this series, where we're going to analyze all of these ideas of Meillassoux that we've talked about, and I guess, like I called it, critique them. But yeah, I'm just going to pick them apart, find out what they're made of, and see how all of these pieces fit together, or if they do, or where they don't fit together quite right. That's kind of what we're going to be doing for the next 4 videos or so. So we're starting with just broadly Meillassoux' idea of correlationism. So I want to take that apart in this video and just see where, just to identify where things don't quite line up in his thought here. That's going to be the first part is a fairly detailed breakdown of correlationism. Then I'll kind of summarize this with, or summarize the analysis by identifying the problems that the analysis shows in Meillassoux' correlationism, and we'll finish with a third part which looks at the religionizing of reason. If you remember, we talked about that back in the first video. So 3 parts today to the video, and we'll start with correlationism. So remembering here, correlationism, it just means we never have access to the thing in itself, to being, or to reality independent of human beings. These are all the same. These all mean the same thing. And the reason is everything is always what it is for us. So we've kind of privileged our human, not so much human, our thinking perspective. We've privileged that in such a way that we can't get outside of ourselves. Subjectivity has become this central starting point from which all of our thought begins. And that means that anytime we try and think anything outside of it, we end up referring back to ourselves, essentially. So that's how Meillassoux understands correlationism. Let's break this down. So the first thing to note is that we can actually talk about correlationism in 2 senses. And Meillassoux doesn't distinguish between these two. But the first sense is the phenomenological one. And this means reality as it is experienced. And such a thing, obviously, reality as it's experienced, is necessarily correlated with thought. It must be, because we're talking about reality as it's experienced for us, by us. So that means things like secondary qualities, right? The colors, tastes, smells, those kinds of things are just as real in a phenomenological sense as the primary qualities that science investigates: solidity, extension, motion, those types of things. However, even though they are not the former, even though the secondary qualities are not quantitative or objective, even though they only have meaning for us as subjects from a subjective perspective, they're still just as real in this phenomenological sense, in the sense of describing human experience. And this kind of correlationism, so there is a correlation. I don't even like to call it correlationism because it's such a negative term. It's deliberately so, I think. But we'll use it anyway. But this kind of correlation is distinct from science then, and also metaphysics, which is going to be an important point later on, but it's still valid. And it's the kind of reality that people like Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, Levinas, Husserl as well, although There are a couple of niggling issues there, but that's essentially the reality that they described. And even though it's not scientific, even though it's not objective in that strict sense of the word, it's just as real, right? Reality as we live it is real. There's no other way to put it. So phenomenological reality is a valid and legitimate type of reality, even though it's not scientific. So even though it differs from that, it's still just as valid. And obviously the correlation is necessary there, correlation between thought and phenomenological being. So this is not the kind of being that, not the kind of correlation that Meillassoux is ostensibly dealing with. But we're going to see when we get to the second part of the video that he is, I think, drawing on this type of correlationism. He's drawing on the connection between thought and being that's in phenomenology when he's thinking of correlationism. But we'll talk more about that later. Just keep that in mind. Phenomenology, there is this phenomenological sense of correlationism. So that's the first kind of correlation we could talk about. The second kind is one that I've called external reality, correlation in relation to external reality. And here I mean reality independent of or prior to thinking beings. So in contradistinction to the phenomenological reality, which is connected with experiencing beings because it's describing those beings' experience. So external reality as correlationism. This is what Meillassoux is talking about. And this is the being or the in itself that Meillassoux has in mind. A reality and a being independent of thinking beings. And the problem is that Meillassoux doesn't interrogate this in itself completely or in the right way or at all. Actually, he just assumes this there is this reality independent of human beings, and he goes from there. That's what he's after, but he hasn't looked at that carefully enough, and that turns out to be a big problem, because there are actually two senses of the in itself, or we could also say two kinds of being when we're talking about external reality. The first we can call scientific being, and this is just objective reality. I think that's the best way to think about this. So there's a correlation here as well. There was a correlation as similar to the one that we saw between thinking and being and phenomenology. So there's correlation there. There's also a correlation here between thought and scientific being. But it's very different from the one between thought and phenomenological being. So let's look at Meillassoux' question here, and this will give us an entry point into this kind of correlationism. So his question is, did the accretion of the Earth happen 4.56 billion years ago? And he thinks from the scientific perspective, he can answer yes, while the correlationist has no choice but to answer no, or yes, but with these qualifications. Yes, it happened, but it only happened for us. It only makes sense in relation to us. That's the whole idea of correlationism. However, I think it's actually the opposite. This is actually, Meillassoux got this around backwards. So the correlationist, thinking in terms of the for us, is the one who can say yes, the accretion of the Earth happened 4.56 billion years ago. Whereas the scientist, thinking in terms of this in itself, this objective, independent reality, is forced to say no. Why? The reason is Meillassoux asking for an in itself answer, but he's posing a question that only makes sense from a for us perspective. So think about that question. The accretion of the earth happened 4.56 billion years ago. So the earth, what is the earth here? It's a concept that only has significance for us, for beings like us viewing the world from our perspective, right? If we think about the earth from a purely disinterested, perspectiveless perspective, right, which is the objectivist dream, the dream of the objective thinker, is to get that view from nowhere, right? Well, if we think about that, such a view, there's no earth, because all there is fundamental particles, right? It's just a collection of fundamental particles moving in certain ways, interacting with each other in certain ways, and that's all. There's nothing else there. The earth, however, could not be more removed from that. The earth, despite being an accumulation of them, despite there being nothing over and above that accumulation, is totally different from a whole bunch of particles moving together, right? The earth is something that it's this globe of matter, a solid mass that is orbiting around the sun, that has different ecosystems on it, that has continents and oceans and animals on it and organisms and everything that goes into what the earth is. That concept just doesn't exist if you take out any perspective. In particular, if you take out the perspective that we inhabit, for whom the earth appears as it does, as this object with all of those properties that I described before. If you abstract out from that perspective, and from any perspective, to get a reality completely independent of perspective, then the earth doesn't exist. It's just atoms. And the same thing holds for time, 4.56 billion years ago. What does that mean? That only makes sense for beings who live in time, for whom time is a feature of reality. And as science has told us, if you go down to the level of fundamental particles, time has no arrow. There's no distinction between forward and backwards in time. The same event can happen. If you see an event play out, you can't tell whether it's happening forwards in time or backwards in time, because there's no distinction. Time only makes sense when you have this perspective, when you have a perspective on reality. Without that, if it's pure objectivity, purely independent of any kind of thought, of any kind of perspective, there is no time. So it doesn't make sense to talk about time or 4.56 billion years. So nothing in Meillassoux' question there is independent of thinking beings. So that's what I mean when I say he's asking for an in itself answer, but posing a question that only makes sense from a for us perspective. Now, the objection that may occur to you here is that, okay, so the earth is this particular object with all the properties that we can attribute to it, but it isn't anything over and above the atoms of which it's comprised. It's just kind of a different way of looking at those same atoms. The scientist, the true objective thinker, can still see everything that I've described in the earth through this objective independent lens. But that's not right. The connection between those two ideas is false. The idea that just because there's no extra special, there's nothing added to reality to get to the earth from just the atoms, from the particles, to go from there to the idea that therefore the particles, all of the information that we could want or need is contained in a description purely of fundamental particles, isn't correct. The earth, even though it's true that there is no extra entity or anything extra being added to the particles themselves to give us the earth is still only graspable from a perspective. If you imagine shrinking yourself down to the size of an atom or a particle, there is no earth anywhere there. It's all just particles, right? It's just going to be in this area where we would have said is the earth. There are particles connected in certain ways that are different from other areas where particles are connected in different ways, but it's still just a sea of particles with different connections. There's nothing you can plausibly, reasonably call an earth. It's just particles with connections, with certain connected in certain ways, interacting with each other in certain ways. Yeah, there are these fundamental distinctions, but you can't get anything like an earth from that. To have the notion of an object like that, like an earth, needs a fundamentally different perspective, it needs a perspective on those things that is greater than them, or that's different from the perspective you would get if you reduce everything out to this lowest common denominator of particles. A good example actually is a conversation I was having with a friend recently about a building, and he insisted that because the atoms that make up the building are in constant motion, the building itself is moving. But clearly this is wrong. Buildings don't move, right? Buildings don't move, even though the atoms that make them up are constantly moving. And that's because there's a difference. We're operating at different levels here. We're thinking in different types of being. When you're looking at a building from the perspective of a human being, they're stationary. They're not moving. But if you were to cut away all perspective and just go right down to the core of what everything's made of, those little constituents of matter, then yes, everything is always moving. Everything's always in flux. But it doesn't make sense to try and jump those levels just because at the level of individual atoms, everything is in constant motion. Therefore, anything from any perspective must also be in constant motion, because quite clearly buildings aren't moving. It doesn't make any sense to say that. Buildings only make sense. In fact, buildings only make sense. It only makes sense to talk about buildings from this greater perspective, from a perspective that isn't locked in on that fundamental level. Because again, like I said, if you go down to that level, it's just atoms. Where the building used to be, it's just atoms of a certain kind or connected in certain ways, arranged in certain configurations. And right next door to that, what is it? More atoms. connected in different ways, arranged in different configurations, moving at different speeds or whatever it might be. But it's all just atoms. You lose the building if you go down to that level. And that's what you get if you conflate these two ideas, or if you get these ideas, if you ignore the correlationist as Meillassoux says it, for us perspective, and try for this pure scientific perspective. So let's bring this back to get the things back on track here. So thought and scientific being are correlated, but far from being a bad thing, far from being a situation that obscures this scientific objective reality, it's precisely because of this correlation that we're able to think scientific reality meaningfully. For the correlationist, the correlation between thought and being yields objects, meaning, all described in terms of language. But for Meillassoux' pure scientist, who attempts to reject any kind of correlation between thought and being, one only sees fundamental particles, non-meaning. There's no meaning at that level, and everything's described in terms of equations. And the reason I say the scientist is attempting to reject any correlation is because it's actually impossible. The scientist that we're referencing here is a pure scientist, the one who wants to see the world without any kind of correlation, is not a scientist, is not doing science, can't do science. It's a fiction. And there's another objection that might occur to you here, which is that you could say, okay, so you've said science, pure scientist, can't talk in terms of objects. They only see fundamental particles in which there's no meaning at that level, and everything's described in equations. But that's only physics, surely. Other types of other domains of science, disciplines, talk in terms of objects. Every other discipline, in fact, talks in terms of objects except physics. And that's true. But all that does is reveal the unavoidable correlation between thought and scientific being, revealing the meaning-laden foundations of this scientific being, Meillassoux' dreaded for us. And this is exactly why, by the way, the phenomenologists, Husserl, but also in particular Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, they said that the scientific world is grounded in the human world. Without that original human perspective, you don't have any science afterwards, because there's nothing to talk about. It all just reduces out to meaningless interactions between fundamental particles. Whether these are particles or strings or vibrations of quantum fields or whatever, it doesn't matter. If you abstract out from this correlation, keep using Meillassoux' negative word, but if you abstract out from that correlation, then you lose the ability to talk about anything, any kind of scientific reality. So that's the first being, the first kind of in itself that belongs to this correlation that we've the second sense of correlation is the one pertaining to external reality. The second type of being, or in itself, if I can use that word, is a metaphysical one, going to metaphysics. And here I'm going to break a little bit with the way Meillassoux talks about metaphysics. In particular, his definition of metaphysics is that involving an absolute entity of some kind. So metaphysics for me is the fundamental nature of reality. And that, I think, is not so different from it's not different, maybe it is different from his definition of metaphysics itself, but it's no different from, I think, his absolute, the being in itself that he's aiming for here. So that's fine, we're kind of aligned there in talking about the fundamental nature of reality. Even though I use the word metaphysics, perhaps he uses the word absolute being or being in itself. Those are kind of the same things. But where I differ from Meillassoux is in how I take that fundamental nature of reality to be. For me, this means reality as a whole. And so the distinction then is between the whole, which is metaphysical reality, Meillassoux' absolute, and the parts. And the parts is precisely what science studies. Scientific being is dealing with parts. And so once we have that distinction, once we make that distinction clear, then things start to fall into place. And it's, by the way, this is, I think, a fairly clear, although maybe it's not non-controversial, but it's hard for me to see how it could be otherwise. In order for something to be a part, it has to exist amongst other things. It has other parts which it isn't. In order for a part to be a part, it has to have clear boundaries within which we can talk about it as what it is, and outside of which we can talk about it as what it isn't. So it has to have those two dimensions, the inner and the outer. And that means there has to be an outer. There has to be a wider context in which we can talk about, in which with reference to which the part makes sense. But when we're talking about metaphysical reality, we're talking about the fundamental nature of reality, everything that is. We're talking about the universe in that grandest sense of the term, to mean everything that is. And such a thing cannot be a part because there's nothing outside of it. We can't delimit any boundaries around the whole that is metaphysical reality, because if we could, it would be a part and there'd be something outside of this fundamental nature of reality, the whole that is everything that is. And there can't be anything outside of everything that is. So metaphysical reality is a whole and is not a part. That's kind of a fairly basic start point. And this means that we never have access to metaphysical being. We can never understand the whole, metaphysical reality as a whole. And the reason is simple, because let me build up to that. I'm jumping ahead of myself. We never have access to metaphysical being, but the problem is not that thought and being are correlated, as Meillassoux thinks. Rather, it's that thought and metaphysical being are not correlated in any way. And this is precisely what led to Kant's transcendental break between the noumenal and the phenomenal. So, and a good kind of proof of this, really, actually, I think, is one that Kant gave himself. And he asked, is the universe temporally finite or infinite? That's a metaphysical question. And neither of those answers is tenable. If it's temporally finite, that means it had a start point, But that means if it had a start point, there must have been a time prior to that in which it could start, which means there was something before this absolute start point, which is a contradiction. But if it's infinite, so it didn't have a temporal beginning, then it's existed forever. And that, as an infinite regression, also is a contradiction. So there are only two possible answers to this question. Either the universe had a beginning in time, or it didn't. And neither of those answers make sense. Both involve contradictions. And that is demonstrating, what that demonstrates is a fundamental limitation of thought. It tells us that the categories and the concepts that structure our thought, and which therefore manifest in our language, are all evolved to deal with parts. Not the whole that is metaphysical reality, not this non-part that is the whole of metaphysical reality. Logic breaks down when it tries to understand the whole. And that's because it is rooted in, it has literally evolved to deal with parts. The way that we think is parts-based. And that type of thinking, because the whole that is metaphysical reality is not a part, the way that we think cannot grasp it. And this is why it's really important to get that distinction between parts and the whole down, and which is kind of the central point of my metaphysics, and that the Meillassoux doesn't have here. And I think and like I said, this leads to some fairly big problems. So while for me it's true that we can't know or even think being directly, so this would be Meillassoux' strong correlationism, we can nevertheless indirectly glean a few general insights about metaphysical being based simply on the fact that things have happened, that we're here to talk about it, to wonder about it. The fact that something has happened, gives us some kind of insight. We can infer a few things about metaphysical reality from that, even though we can't directly think it. As we've seen, trying to think metaphysical reality sends us into these contradictions. It winds us up in paradox. But that's just the nature of parts-based thinking when you try and apply it to the whole that is metaphysical reality. And we can make a few insights. I'm not going to go into that in any more detail. There's way too much to talk about there to cover here, and it's kind of ancillary to the point. This is one of the main points of my book, so if you're interested in that, that's where I talk about that. But the central point for us here is that metaphysics, as the fundamental nature of reality, is the investigation of reality as a whole, and we don't have access to this metaphysical reality as a whole because we are parts-based organisms. We think in terms of parts. So Meillassoux right in the sense, in his strong correlationism claim, that we don't have access to metaphysical being, but he's wrong in the reason why he thinks this. He thinks it's because being and thought are correlated, when in actual fact it's because being and thought are not correlated at all. Thought is parts-based, and being, metaphysical being, is a whole, and that's why there's a disconnect there. Okay, so that's kind of that's the analysis of correlationism two kinds of correlationism, phenomenological and external reality. And the external reality correlationism can break down into two further types of being. Correlationism with science, scientific being, in which a correlation exists. And we can talk about correlation between thought and metaphysical being, in which case we've seen there is no correlation there. And that leads us into the second part of the video, which is the problems with correlationism. So Meillassoux' correlationism, his idea that there's this correlation between thinking and being, says that we've retreated inwards. As I said at the beginning, we've privileged subjectivity. We've reduced the external world to the status of a mere relation, a for us. It exists only as in relation to us, to thought. And with that kind of thinking, the idea is that we can't, or we close ourselves off from reality, from being. We make being inaccessible. We make it inaccessible to us by erecting this barrier, this illusory, Meillassoux would say, barrier that says all being must be for us. However, after the analysis in the first part, we can, I think, draw some conclusions now and see some of the mistakes in this notion of correlationism a little bit more clearly. And they break down into four areas. The first concerns metaphysical being. So, as we saw, the consequence of strong correlationism, being as unknowable and unthinkable, is correct. But the premise, Meillassoux' premise, that the premise that Meillassoux bases it on is wrong. As we saw, it isn't because thought and being are correlated that being is unknowable and unthinkable. It's because thought and being, metaphysical being, are not correlated that being is unknowable and unthinkable. And I describe this in terms of wholes and parts, and you really have to think of it in those terms in order for this to make sense. Metaphysical being as a whole, while the thought that we use to investigate it has developed or literally evolved to deal with parts. So it's insufficient, it's inadequate to the task, and we've seen how it breaks down when you try and apply it. When you try and apply those rules of logic, those categories, the concepts within which we think, when you try and use those, apply them to metaphysical reality, things break down. You end up with contradictions and paradoxes. So despite the truth of the consequence, it's nevertheless wrong to see this as negative. This lack of this lack of access to metaphysical being is not a negative. In fact, it's precisely what is required in order for us to live, to have lives, to exist. One can only live in the world as a part. There's just no other way to do it. And because of that, it's incorrect to think of this as a limitation or a restriction or an indication of our finitude, right? These are all negative ways of thinking about it, but it's the only way one can live, one can exist, one can be. In order to be, one must be a part, and what it is to be a part is to think in terms of parts. And that means it necessarily precludes this a clear, direct access to metaphysical reality, which is a whole. So that's the first problem. The second problem concerns the way Meillassoux conflated metaphysical and scientific being. So Meillassoux thinking in metaphysical terms, which we've seen isn't and can't be correlated to thought, but he's doing this within a scientific context. So basically he's trying to do metaphysics in the domain of science. And this is causing some misunderstandings. And it's why he posits what I call the fictional pure scientist, the scientist who wants to understand independent reality as it really is, if you like, reality completely independent of any thinking perspective. In other words, the fictional pure scientist is actually a metaphysical scientist, which is an oxymoron if you understand those terms correctly. So the result of this conflation, this metaphysical thinking within the scientific realm, is that what Meillassoux is actually saying, although he doesn't recognize this, is that because we don't and can't know or even think metaphysical being, we also can't know or think scientific being. And that's incorrect. That's where perhaps the biggest mistake is, because this is the main problem for Meillassoux, the notion that we have no access to science. Well, it's hard to use words because I want to say scientific being, but Meillassoux is saying being itself. But he's the problem for him is that science has been kind of stripped of its objectivity, he thinks. It no longer has access to a reality which is objective. But that's not true, as we saw, because scientific reality, even though, and in fact, it must be correlated with thought in order for it to be meaningful. In order for us to do science, it has to be correlated with thought. Scientific being has to be correlated with thought. Without that, as we saw, it's all just atoms. It's all meaningless. This is, by the way, why I think some people, and we'll look at this with Ray Brassier a little bit later, many scientists think reality is meaningless because they adopt this perspectiveless perspective, the view from nowhere, in which, yeah, sure, if you disregard any perspective, of course there's no meaning. How could there be meaning? Who would there be meaning for? But this is a consequence of trying to take up this the mantle of a pure scientist, the scientist who wants nothing to do with any kind of subjective perspective, a thinking perspective. It just can't be done. Which leads us to the third problem, which concerns scientific being. So Meillassoux here thinks that correlationism prevents us from knowing scientific being, but it's only because our thought is correlated with the world the world that science investigates, i.e. the parts, that we can know anything about it at all. I kind of talked about that in the last problem as well, but I think it's separate because we can break it up into these different areas. So we've got three problems, all related to how Meillassoux sees metaphysical being, how he conflates metaphysical and scientific being, and his notion, how he thinks about scientific being as well. And the last problem that I think we can see a trace of in Meillassoux concerns phenomenological correlationism. And the reason I think this is, even though he doesn't really say much about it, and he doesn't talk about phenomenology at all, really, I still can't help but think his thoughts on correlationism have been influenced by phenomenology and the correlationism that we saw there, because phenomenology, in a way that Kant never did, phenomenology privileges subjectivity the way that Meillassoux talks about it here. He really talks about, when I read him on correlationism, I don't think Kant, actually. I think Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty. I think these people, because they did, and that kind of correlationism, again, it's a negative term which I would never apply to this, but I'm just using Meillassoux' words. That kind of correlationism, it is how Meillassoux describes it, this inward retreating, kind of locking ourselves in within ourselves so nothing makes sense. There's no meaning except for the meaning that a thing has for me. Locking us in this subjective kind of prison, if you like, seeing everything from that perspective. It's so phenomenology, more so than I ever found in Kant. Although perhaps you could argue Kant kind of started it. Phenomenology is just a consequence of that, and that would be fair, I guess. But still, a lot of Meillassoux' thought here and the way he talks about things, correlationism, it smacks of phenomenology to me. And as we saw, phenomenological correlationism is legitimate because it's concerned with human experience, and it isn't metaphysical. It isn't even scientific. So, to the extent that Meillassoux has this kind of as a background driving kind of factor, that's a mistake. And so those are the problems that I see with Meillassoux' correlationism, and I think analysed in that way, all of his complaints about correlationism as a problem, I think it has effectively dissolved all of them. We don't have to worry about the ancestral problem and archaefossils and things like that. The whole premise of correlationism, I think we have effectively dispensed with this. So that's where we finish up with the problems with correlationism. Just before I leave this section, though, I do want to talk about quantum mechanics, actually, briefly, because given that science is so central to Meillassoux' claim here, it is a major omission, I think, for him not to have included a discussion of our most complete scientific formulation of the world to date, quantum mechanics, particularly given the way that what quantum mechanics has to say about precisely the topic of correlationism, which as far as it with regards to the observer effect. This is exactly what Meillassoux claiming, that reality is independent, where there is an ultimate absolute, or there is an absolute, a being in itself that exists independently of us. And quantum mechanics has called that into question. Quantum mechanics as science itself, within the very discipline that Meillassoux is trying to safeguard, they've called this notion of an absolutely independent reality into question. There's no way we can get into this too much here, but let me just give you a quick quote from a really famous, one of the most influential physicists of the 20th century, John Wheeler. Insofar as the act of observation has anything to do with what we ascribe reality to, then we can say this observer who was brought into existence by the universe has, by his act of observation, a part in bringing that universe itself into being. If that's not exactly what Meillassoux is talking about with correlationism, I don't know what is. And particularly given the fact that this is coming from science itself, even if he's going to disregard it, I think he really had to. He really had to discuss this, and I think that's a real omission that I think it's something that really needed to be addressed in this book, given the topic. Okay, so that's the end of this part. Let me move into the last part, which is the religionizing of reason. So you remember with this, Meillassoux claimed that the de-absolutization of thought, reducing being to something unthinkable and unknowable, legitimizes any and all religious or poetical religious, i.e. mystical or spiritual claims. However, so as we've seen, even with my analysis, metaphysical reality is still unknowable and unthinkable. So this on its own doesn't dispense with Meillassoux' claim here. Fortunately, we don't need an analysis. We don't need to show that correlationism there are problems with it, or that we don't need to show the ways in which it doesn't quite fit together the way Meillassoux wants it to, in order to deal with this, because the claim, I think, itself is somewhat unfair. So, even with the idea that we can't say anything about being itself, whether that's because being is always for us, or whether it's because of the nature of metaphysical reality as a whole versus the parts, this still doesn't legitimize religious claims. What it does do, having this inability, or proclaiming this inability to access metaphysical reality, does mean that we cannot refute religious claims to know the existence of God with a positive argument of what the absolute is. But this is only because it denies direct access to any form of absolute at all. So this is not the same as saying, I don't know what metaphysical reality is. And in that case, because if it were, then you would be opening the door to the theologian who says, actually, I do. I have an answer. Then you do, in a sense, legitimize the religious claim. But that's not what we're doing here. We're not saying, I don't know. We're saying it's in either case, whether it's because of Meillassoux' correlationism, or whether it's because of the parts versus the whole, the idea is it's not just I don't know, it's no one can know. And anyone who says that they do, and anyone who says that therefore metaphysical reality is actually this deity that I call Yahweh or whatever, that is wrong. They're talking about something that no one can have any knowledge of. That's different from saying, I don't know, maybe those guys do. So perhaps, I don't know, the worry, it's possible then the worry is that if the only thinkers making positive claims about the absolute, about metaphysical reality, are the theologians, then this is all that people will hear. This is the only solution on the table. This is what they'll take up, simply because there are no alternatives. But in that case, this is more a criticism of the weak-mindedness, really, of the people who are looking for solutions, rather than a criticism of our inability, the fact that metaphysical reality is inaccessible to us. It's more a criticism of the way that people will take any answer, even if it's the wrong one, over a reasonable, carefully thought out approach to the topic. So I don't see this in any way legitimizing religion, and certainly not religionizing reason. So I think here is a good place to talk about it, to move into the summary. So first up, we looked at correlationism itself, and there are two broad domains in which we can talk about correlationism. The first was phenomenology, which concerns reality as it is experienced. And here we saw that thought and being are correlated. And this, even though this is non-scientific, because it's not measurable or objective, it's still valid. And so this is the kind of thinking of people like Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, and so on. And in addition to being non-scientific, it's also non-metaphysical. And that's an important point to keep in mind. The other type of correlationism, or the other sense in which we can talk about correlationism, is as regards external reality. And by this I just mean the opposite of phenomenology, basically. Reality independent of thinking beings. And here we saw that there were two kinds of being. The first was as it pertains to science. So by this I mean objective reality. And here we saw that, again, thought and being are correlated. But it's because of this correlation between thought and being that we have objects, that we can have a discussion of meaning, that meaning exists, and and all of this can be discussed and explored through language without any kind of correlation. So what I call Meillassoux' fictional pure scientist, all we have are particles. There's no meaning to be found anywhere, and everything's described in terms of indifferent, empty of content equations, empty of any concrete content equations, mathematics. The other kind of being here is the metaphysical one. And this concerns the fundamental nature of reality, in particular the fundamental nature of reality as a whole. And here there is no correlation between thought and being. And the reason is simple. We are parts which have evolved to deal with parts. And this includes our thinking. So logic, the categories of our thought, all of this breaks down at the level of the whole when we try and turn that type of thinking, parts-based thinking, to the whole. We end up in paradoxes and contradictions. Thus, we cannot know or even think metaphysical being. Then we looked at some problems then, but on the basis of this, some problems that exist with correlationism. The first concerned metaphysical being. So even though, we can't actually know metaphysical being, but this turned out to be because thought and being are not correlated. The exact opposite of Meillassoux' position. And we also saw that this is not a bad thing. It's just what it is to exist at all. To exist is to exist as a part. And that means that necessarily precludes being able to think and know directly metaphysical reality. The second problem was with the way that Meillassoux conflates metaphysical and scientific being. So he was essentially thinking science in metaphysical terms, or perhaps better, thinking metaphysically in a scientific context. And this created problems everywhere, basically. It meant that the conclusions that he was drawing about scientific being, importing as they were, these metaphysical ideas all turned out to be inaccurate and wild, and leading to wild misunderstandings. The third problem was related to scientific being. The correlation that exists here between thought and being as in terms of scientific being, is necessary and good. It's necessary because without it, you have nothing. Science can't operate without the objects that the correlation between thought and being provide. And it's good because it lets us talk about reality, objective reality, even though it's not this purely objective reality, a reality from the view from nowhere, even though it still has a perspective. Without that, there's nothing to talk about again. And finally, the final problem concerned phenomenological correlation, and I think this has influenced Meillassoux, but the problem is that there's nothing wrong with phenomenological correlationism or correlation in phenomenology. I still don't like using that word correlationism with regards to this because it is so negative. But yeah, just these are the terms that I'm using, just taking them up from Meillassoux. So it's influenced him, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's valid. It's equally valid to talk about human experience, in which as reality as what we experience, but it's neither scientific being nor is it metaphysical being. And this conflation here that Meillassoux slipped into weakens everything. It just creates misunderstandings and fundamental problems in his notion of correlationism. Finally, we looked at the religionizing of reason, and I think correlationism doesn't legitimize religion in any way. It may mean that theologians are the only ones offering a positive count of the absolute, but that will never amount to a criticism of the person who denies that we can have any access to the absolute. At the most, it's kind of special pleading for those who will take any answer, any appeal to an absolute, even if it's wrong, over a more reasoned and more in-depth investigation into the absolute. Okay, so that is where I'm going to finish up this video. Some, I think, fatal flaws within Meillassoux' notion of correlationism. That in and of itself, I think, doesn't necessarily weigh on the rest of what he has to say. Because the rest of what he has to say is about trying to find a way to get access to the absolute. Perhaps what I said about metaphysical being is a problem there, does kind of put an end to any future attempt by anybody to talk about metaphysical reality. But the point is still, he has some arguments for how he thinks we can get there. We can actually talk about the absolute, and it's definitely worth looking at those and breaking those up into their constituent components to see where things break down as well there. Anyway, we'll do that in the next couple of videos. I'm going to take a break next week. I'm going to be away on Friday, so I won't be able to make a video then. But 2 weeks later, I'll be back and we'll get into his argument for the principle of factiality. Okay, thanks for watching. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you next time.